Let's get straight into it. Pablo, can you give us an update?
I have an update, which just
news
from the last few minutes, and that is that the state of Georgia has been called by AP for Donald Trump. So Joe Biden, of course, won Georgia back in 2020. So that's a big upset for the Harris campaign. Of course, this is following on from North Carolina, which was also called earlier, and that is a state that has also gone to Donald Trump. A little bit less of a surprise, perhaps, in North Carolina. The last time it went Democrat was back in 2008. We're keeping a close eye on, of course, the other swing states at the moment. Pennsylvania, which is also looking to be headed in the direction of Trump. But of course, it's very early days there in Pennsylvania. Michigan, at the moment, also around 60% of the votes counted in the state of Michigan, also leaning towards Trump. Wisconsin, too, around 85% of the votes counted there. And also just Trump is in a slight lead there. Out west, Arizona, very, very tight. It's actually, there's around 10,000 votes in it at the moment in Arizona. Trump is slightly ahead. And finally, we're getting some results in from Nevada. 6 electoral college votes there. At the moment, Donald Trump in the lead, too, with around 75% of the votes counted.
So, Pablo, we've now got these 2 swing states, Georgia and North Carolina, both been called by the Associated Press in favor of Donald Trump. I guess we're now at the point where we can do a post-mortem of Kamala Harris's campaign in Georgia. Stephen, you're from Georgia, you're from the state. Can you tell us where you think her message failed to resonate, or what Trump brought to the table that she couldn't?
I mean, it's hard to say. I would imagine that in Georgia, it probably trended like a lot of other states where we've seen Trump outperform himself from 2020, and the Democratic candidate, in this case, Kamala Harris, underperform what Democrats did in 2020. You also have to remember that in Georgia in 2020, there were 2 big Senate races that brought a lot of people out to the polls. You know, Georgia, a state where, since I grew up there, and then in the years that have passed, it's become much more cosmopolitan. It's become much more. You see larger gay populations moving into Atlanta, for example. A lot of the metro area has really built out. You see an African American population that has expressed itself more and more in the polls, that has come to serve as a counterweight to a very traditional white vote that actually used to be Democratic, traditionally solidly Democratic when the Democrats were against civil rights and a lot of the positions that aligned southern states. It then switched to the Republicans really beginning in the late 90s, 2000s, and it's remained solidly that way. So 2020, whether that was an outlier, whether that was because of the candidate at that time, whether it was because of the Senate races, that's really difficult to say. But the underlying demographics haven't necessarily changed that much. It is a state that's very diverse and that will continue to be more than likely in play.
Now, Jessica, I'll come to you in just a moment, but we do want to get across to Washington, D.C. and our correspondent there, Janelle Dumoulin, because things are moving quite quickly. She's been there reporting from the Kamala Harris watch party at Howard University. Let's get an update on what the mood is like there. Janelle, good morning. Tell us how things are looking. Oh, we've just had a technical issue, but we will come to her in just a moment. Oh, do we have the line up? It's not in our favor today. We will come to Janelle when we get the chance. But Jessica, then we can come to you first as well. What do you think Donald Trump had to offer these voters? What do you think were the messages from his campaign that have really resonated here?
Very strong messages. First of all, of course, the economy. We've been talking about this all night. But he's also presented the strong man. And I see, particularly around female voters, older and younger voters, the promise of a man who is going to protect not just America, but who's going to protect women, even if they don't want to be protected. That doesn't really matter. But that seems to be, on the emotional level, a very, very powerful message that I think the Democrats could not really match equally, because Kamala Harris has been very explicit on, I'm not running as a woman, I'm not running as an African American, I'm running as somebody who brings people together. And so that wasn't really a match for that particular message. So I think that's pretty strong. Foreign policy-wise, we've already talked about this tonight. I think he's tried to distance himself from the Democratic Party or the Democrats outlook on particular focus points in the world, but at the same time, he hasn't been very clear, and it doesn't really matter in the context of the U.S. election. So I would really stress the economy and the role of women in this election.
It's really fascinating to hear. Now, for our viewers watching at home, you can see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen there, the Trump Watch Party. Get some reaction to this latest news that's just come in about Georgia and North Carolina, those two key swing states being called by the Associated Press in favor of Trump. We are expecting to see the former president speak at some point, but that's just to give you a sense of the flavor of the evening as things develop. For now, though, Stephen, maybe you could just set the stakes. How important are the results of this election, and what is at stake for American democracy?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the big questions, right? I mean, you read some of the media here in Germany where we are, and there's a very particular take. America at the Abyss, I think, was one of the head articles for the main magazine, Der Spiegel here. And there is this sense that democracy is at stake here. And while I find maybe that's a bit too much to say, this isn't going to be a dictatorship that's ushered in by any means, there are obviously threats to institutions here. And I think that's something that a lot of people are concerned about. And Jessica can obviously speak to this as well from a historian's lens. But, Donald Trump has been very clear that he wants to change even further the amount of executive power that exists in the United States, right? There's shared power between the legislature, the executive, and then the Supreme Court as well. And we've seen the Supreme Court is much more favorable to conservative ideas right now based on its current makeup. We know that the executive over decades, centuries, as Jessica could probably say, has gotten more and more powerful. And what we're seeing now is that there is this will and desire to take more of those levers and put them in the hands of the executive, of the president. So, for example, Department of Justice, which he feels very aggrieved towards because of the investigations from the FBI, because of prosecutions that he's facing, he wants that to be more under his control. That's something that he's made very clear, and that's something that his close advisors want to make happen as well. So that would mean then that we could potentially see political persecutions. We could see political investigations in a worst-case scenario. That's something that his supporters have made very clear, his advisors have made very clear that they're interested in, is bringing the Department of Justice really as an independent entity, actually more under the control of the White House. Right now, you have the DOJ, the Department of Justice, with investigations into President Joe Biden for his handling of classified security, classified material. You have an investigation into his son, Hunter Biden. And so that is hard to imagine under a Trump presidency. Those would be no-go areas that you could have a Department of Justice that stands so alone from the White House that it's able to investigate or at least create special counsels to look into the president, to look into the president's son. That shows you the degree of separation that you have right now and that traditionally you have had. And that's something that they've clearly made a target. And so to me, that is one of the biggest danger points. When people talk about the dangers to American democracy, you see that kind of the lack of institutionalization, that unwinding of that institutionalization.
I'm curious to get the historian's view here. Jessica, what will the book say about this?
Because there are two things that are pretty special about what you just described. One is that, yes, it's true, the American executive has over time become stronger and stronger, but typically we always had crisis points, right? Civil War, or World War I, the Great Depression, or the Second World War, some sort of crisis. That's not really the case here. Trump is simply assuming or wants to assume more power, period. There's not an external reason to do so. And the other thing is what I find curious about Trump is that he has always been promising voters more states' right and more decentralization. At the same time, he's vying so overtly for central power.
But it's this deep state narrative that he has,
yes,
correct? And he believes that is sort of this tipping point. I'm curious if that really goes beyond his core believers, though, and into a wider mainstream electorate here in the U.S. And that I don't know.
You mean among viewers outside of the United States?
Well, in the U.S., for example, because obviously his core believers have a strong belief in this idea of the deep state, right? That it's been set up against him, that it's led by the DOJ, it's led by these persecutions, these prosecutions, I should say, into him, against him. To what extent, I wonder, is the larger electorate willing to buy this to the extent that they would see the DOJ become weaponized to some extent? I think that's what will be interesting in the coming...
That's not really been part of the campaign, right? What the campaign has been very much about what you just said, the kind of the idea about the deep state that needs to be combated or that needs to be defied. what he really wants to do, I think, is what many voters are really interested in, right?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and that's what will be interesting to see as we go forward if he wins this thing, right?
This is a fascinating conversation. I understand we have some comments coming in.
That's right. We've got loads of comments coming in. I'm glad you guys are actually talking about this because we actually have had a question about the US democracy and what it means going forward if Donald Trump actually does become the president. We've been just talking about that, but a lot of comments are coming in about Ukraine and what a Trump presidency could mean for Ukraine and the US's relationship with Ukraine and, of course, NATO.
Stephen, do you want to take that
I think
one?
we can only judge by what he's said on the campaign trail, what he's done in the past as well, and both of those things don't point in the favor of Ukraine, frankly. He's rarely had a bad thing to say about Russia and about its leader, Vladimir Putin. And this is a case, obviously, where Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine. So we can only imagine that he's going to look with favor upon the Russian side. He's also said on the campaign trail that he wants to end the war. I think that has resonated with voters when it comes to foreign policy, to the extent that foreign policy really resonates with American voters, which is also arguable. But when it comes to Ukraine, I think there is a concern that there's too much money being spent, that it needs to be wrapped up. And he said that he will, of course, create a great big deal for both of them, that they'll both be happy with. What that means remains to be seen. But given his affinity to Vladimir Putin, I think we have to wonder and assume that it's not going to be in favor of the Ukrainians.